As you can see, we're looking at impacts of testing on teacher labor market decisions. Have some disclaimers here. Our data is from the state longitudinal data system in Georgia, so they require us to say these things. And this is part of work funded by CALDER, of which we're much appreciative. So there's lots of angst about testing in public schools, and that this notion that there's too much testing going on. And related to that is concern that testing may be driving teachers out of the classroom, that testing may be taking away from instructional time, reducing flexibility of teachers, and too much time is spent on teaching to the test. Though surprisingly, there's very little empirical evidence on that issue of are teachers really being driven out by too much testing. Third motivation is the change in the legal environment, that we're now in the ESSA environment where states have greater flexibility over their testing, and many states are changing the amount and kinds of tests they give. And this was especially well timed. Just days after we published our working paper, the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, came out with a proposal to eliminate 5 of the tests in Georgia, 4 in high school and 1 in middle school. And related to the issue of testing, not only is the question about teachers potentially leaving public schools because of too much testing, but also the distribution of teachers across grades and schools. So you can imagine in a high stakes accountability environment, principals may choose to reallocate their teachers to the grades that are being tested and hence counted for accountability purposes. And potentially you may see shifting of teachers across schools if the accountability regime is partly reflecting levels of educational performance, and hence an incentive to move to schools where on average students do better, irrespective of school quality. There's been a little work in this area, but actually not much. Most has been tied to the initiation of testing and school accountability. So work by folks in this room, Sunny and Charlie and their co-authors in North Carolina, looking at the impacts of the initiation of testing and school accountability. They find some increased likelihood of exit for rookie teachers, and some impacts on teacher mobility across grades. Also work by Don Boyd, Susanna Loeb and colleagues in New York. Once again, initiation of a testing regime. And then some work on a nationwide basis looking at the rollout of NCLB and impacts on teacher labor market choices. There's also a couple papers looking at accountability pressure. So work I did with Lee Fung and David Figlio in Florida, where Florida changed the rules for assigning school grades. So there were unexpected changes in the school grades that schools received. And we look at the impact on teacher turnover, and basically find that the only thing that seems to matter in that case are schools facing a threat of receiving a failing grade. So moving from an A to a B or B to C doesn't matter, but the possibility of being labeled an F school does impact teacher mobility. So in this paper, we're doing something a bit different. Rather than looking at differences in accountability pressure or initiation of a new accountability or testing regime, we're looking at changes to an existing testing regime. And we think this is really most relevant for decision making today, because we now live in an environment where most states have a wide range of tests mandated by NCLB and ESSA. And the policy choice is really, do we scale back within the limits of ESSA? We take a standard difference in differences approach because we're going to exploit changes in the testing regime in the state of Georgia. And we're going to compare teacher mobility in grades where tests were dropped versus grades where testing didn't change. So 3 research questions here. The main and I think most important is the changes in the testing environment have an impact on the likelihood that teachers leave public schools. In particular, does removing testing make it more likely they stay? Second, do we see impacts of changes in the testing regime on teacher mobility within school across grades? And then finally, we try and look a bit at, are there any impacts on school quality, in particular the distribution of school quality? So here's a sort of brief summary of testing in Georgia. The statewide testing regime essentially started in 2000. Unlike many other states, Georgia started with testing grades 1 through 8 and tested up to 5 subjects initially. In 2012, they rolled out a new school accountability system called the CCRPI, or College and Career Readiness Performance Index. That's sort of a mishmash of a lot of things, of growth and levels and other factors. Under that system, like many states, schools get assigned letter grades. And the lowest 5% are subject to possible sanctions, a mix of carrots and sticks. In Georgia, there's no statewide high-stakes accountability system. There are districts in Georgia that employ various metrics and tie them to evaluation of teachers. Some use value-added type measures, some use student growth percentiles, some use a mix of things. So just visually, here are the changes that went on in Georgia. You can see that initially, our data started in 2007, testing in all grades 1 through 8 and across all 5 of these subjects. The first change was starting in 2011, testing was dropped in grades 1 and 2. And then subsequent to that in 2015, reading was eliminated, so we moved down to 4 subject areas. And then finally, in 2017, testing in science and social studies was limited to the end of elementary, grade 5, and the end of middle school, grade 8. Now, throughout all this, there's also testing in high school with end of course exams. We're focusing on elementary and middle in this analysis. So essentially, we're looking at 2 regime changes here. The first is between 2010 and 2011, where the state dropped testing in grades 1 and 2, and then between 2016 and 2017, where they dropped testing in science and social studies in certain grades. As I mentioned, data comes from the Georgia award systems, Georgia's state longitudinal data system. That database starts in the 2006-07 school year, and the latest data we had available at the time was through 2018. Like most other states, it covers both teachers and students, and we're focusing on elementary and middle school. And we also are going to look at some breakouts between both all teachers and early career teachers, which we're defining as those with less than 5 years experience. So as you might expect, turnover is greater among early career teachers. Whether it's leaving the profession or switching districts, switching schools, in all cases, early career teachers are more mobile. And you can see that in the state of Georgia, about a quarter of teachers are African American, about 3/4 are white. So we're going to exploit those 2 regime changes, the removal of testing in grades 1 and 2 in 2011, and the removal of testing in science and social studies in grades 3, 4, 6, and 7. And then we're going to also, so we're going to do a so-called multinomial logit analysis, where we're looking at multiple options that teachers have in terms of staying in the same school, changing grades, changing schools, etc. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation in measures of teacher mobility. Here we're looking at exiting the profession. It does bounce around a fair amount. The idea here would be on the left, where we're looking at that drop of testing in grades 1 and 2, which are the two checkered lines. If that had an impact, we'd expect that after 2010, we'd see a reduction in attrition relative to the other grades. And you know, nothing really pops out there. Yeah, they're going down, but so are some of the other grades where testing was still going on. In the middle school change, we only have one post year, so we're more limited in comparisons. But once again, nothing really pops out from the data. Likewise, for changing schools, we don't see much going on just visually, or changing grades within school. So really have to look to a numeric analysis to see if indeed there's no impact, or if there is an impact. And so in the difference in difference analysis, the key thing to look at is the interaction between the post period and the treated group. In this case, like the first and second grade teachers who no longer experienced high stakes testing. And you can see for teachers as a whole, not much effect. Looks like there may be a very slight 0.5%, or excuse, yeah, 0.5% change in the likelihood of changing grades within school, but generally not much. We do see a bit of action amongst early career teachers. So there does seem to be a reduction in exit, but the proportion is really small. It's about 1 percentage point, which given a base of about 14%, so we're looking at 14% exit rate, move down to 13%, or about a 7% reduction. So it's there, but not very big. And we're not finding it for teachers as a whole. And even for the early career teachers, we're not seeing impacts on change grades within school. And also sort of a placebo test that we wouldn't expect this policy to affect movements across districts, because everybody in the state is subject to the same testing regime. And in fact, we don't see any impacts on inter-district mobility. So here, once again, are the highlights. We're seeing some impact for early career teachers, nothing in terms of changing districts, and maybe a small change for teachers as a whole in changing grades. If we look at the second regime change, where testing was removed from in science and social studies in certain grades, we find basically nothing. And if anything, slight reduction in exit for early career teachers, but once again, the magnitude is relatively small. And you see that here. And then lastly, we tried to look at the distribution of school value added. The graph is not very helpful there, but if you look at the table, that there are some changes going on, but so statistically there are different distributions, but de facto there's just not much happening. And that's true across both subjects. So our takeaways are that eliminating testing, at least in the grades where it was done in the state of Georgia, doesn't seem to affect the overall likelihood that teachers leave the profession. It has some small effects on early career teachers, but those are relatively modest in magnitude. We don't see any consequential changes in school quality as a result of changing which grades are tested. But it's important to keep in mind, this is not the only reason that people complain about testing. Part of it is issues around potentially driving teachers from the profession, but also concern that it may have negative effects for students, that spending too much time teaching to the test may harm students, and that's follow-up work we hope to do is looking at did these changes in testing in the lower grades impact their school performance later on. Thank you.